before we, end our presentation, I just wanted to make sure the court is aware that all of the images and videos that were presented today, I believe it states exhibits 1 to 13 for this hearing, were full exhibits agreed to by defense. On top of that, Your Honor, we have requested and asked of everyone in the audience who remains, and my understanding is there are no other individuals who wish to be heard today.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate that. Any objection to any of the exhibits being marked as full exhibits?
No, Your Honor.
And as I said, and I've previously ruled that there are some of the images that are under seal. These are photographs that depict the victims at the crime scene and at least one autopsy image. Those are going to remain under seal given the privacy interests of the people who are involved and to respect their dignity. I think that that's important, and I don't think there's any objection to those images remaining under seal. They're part of the court's record, but they'll remain under seal. But I have looked at each of them. So, yes, I know Attorney Prusiner, Attorney Taggart-Hampton. I don't know who's going to start.
How do we simultaneously honor the humanity of people who cause harm and those who suffer it? How do we address the loss, the anger, the grief, the senselessness of this case? To the Sweeney and Southwick families, there's nothing I can say, there's nothing Eric could say that would be enough to acknowledge the enormity of your loss. There's nothing we can say to make you feel better. That day, all of your lives were irrevocably shattered. The loss of those 3 young, vibrant souls is devastating. And we want you to know that it was never, and it still is not, the intent of anyone involved in this case to minimize or ignore the extent and depth of your loss. In recent weeks, we've been talking to Eric about Cassandra and Benjamin and Mason, about who they were as people, about the happy memories he had with them. We talked about his memories of going apple picking with Cassandra, the cookouts she would organize, all the different activities, her love of seasonal decorations. We talked about Benjamin's love of dinosaurs, how he knew dinosaur names his parents would need to look up. We talked about how he would bring books to Eric and they would sit on the couch for an hour together reading. He had a favorite blanket he would carry. We talked about how Mason was still developing his own interests. Mostly he wanted to play with whatever his older brother had. He loved stuffed animals. He loved playing with remote controls. We talked about coming home from school each day and hearing the boys yell, "Uncle Eric!" Eric is not a very expressive person, for reasons I'll get to later in this argument. But when he talks about Mason and Ben, you can hear the love and the affection in his voice, and a rare smile creeps onto his face. He speaks about Sean and Cassandra with love and respect and gratitude. He was and still is in awe of what they accomplished at such a young age. Well, the state and those in the Southwick and Sweeney families may not believe it, and I understand why. He did love them. And even 3 years later, he speaks about Cassandra and Ben and Mason in the present tense. Cassandra, Ben, and Mason Sweeney lost their lives on August 2nd, 2022. Ben and Mason will not get to fall in love or get married. They will not graduate from high school or even have their first day of kindergarten. Cassandra will not get to witness any of those significant events in the lives of the children she adored. The people in this courtroom today lost 3 loved ones. Cassandra, Benjamin, and Mason were so lucky to have so many people who loved them deeply. When I first got this case, my own son was 3 years old. When I looked at the crime scene photos for the first time, I recognized toys in the playroom as toys I have in my own home. And watching the videos today, I recognize the toy bins as the same ones I have in my living room. Losing young children so violently and senselessly must create pain that I can only imagine. Nothing we say today is meant to take away from the Southwick and Sweeney family's grief and their loss. I hope that we can honor your family and the harm caused while also acknowledging the humanity of the person who caused it. Supreme Court advocate Brian Stevenson said, "We have a choice. We can embrace our humanness, which means embracing our broken natures and the compassion that remains our best hope for healing. Or we can deny our brokenness, forswear compassion, and as a result, deny our own humanity." We are asking the court today to embrace compassion so everyone in this courtroom can move forward with healing. I want to take a moment and outline for the court our planned structure. First, I'm going to speak about Eric's history. Then we're going to call Dr. Carrie Oyen to testify via WebEx about juvenile brain development. Then we're going to call Dr. Lori Guidry to talk about Eric's particular psychology. Attorney Taggart Hampton will then speak about legal issues. We have a friend and mentor of Eric's who would like to make a statement of support, and then I'll make a concluding argument.
Absolutely.
When Eric was 8 years old, he told his therapist, "I wish that I could start my life all over at 8 and have a mom that makes good decisions and have a man that I can call my father." 8 years old. That's a second grader. That is a child saying, "I am not okay. I am not safe." Eric never knew his father, and he had a mother who made nothing but bad decisions. I'm going to tell you a bit about Eric's life, and as I do, I'm asking you to think about what this little boy's life was like, what was his actual lived experience day to day. Eric cannot count the number of homes he lived in. His records reflect multiple men he referred to as daddy or stepdad. He routinely slept on the floor, ate spoiled food, wore dirty clothes to school. He watched his mother's boyfriends hit her. He saw his mother and her friends use drugs. When he was in his mother's care, he never started and finished the school year in the same school. This is not just a list of events. This is a way of living that was profoundly altering of his brain and bodily function. We can talk about data. We can talk about the sheer number of adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs, this little boy had. And Dr. Oyen's going to talk about what those are. And this is important because there's proof. There is scientific research telling us that these things change children's brains. And while they're not a checklist, Eric does check every single one of the ACEs boxes, which is incredibly rare. Each one of these things that happened to Eric Sweeney was part of a devastating, cascading series of events, and each one of these things damaged his brain and damaged his psyche. When Eric was a baby, his aunt walked into his house and found him in a car seat in a room filled with crack smoke. When Eric was 18 months old, his mom temporarily gave guardianship to her parents because she was being investigated by DCYF regarding her care for another sibling. No one ever checked to see if his mother's home or her parents' home was actually safe for that toddler, Eric. When Eric was 4 years old, he was sexually abused by a man his mother was dating. And sometimes, respectfully, I think we use the term sexual abuse and we glaze over it in our minds. Those of us who work in the court system see these cases day in and day out, sadly. But I ask you to take a moment and think about a 4-year-old child left in a room by a mother with an adult, told he's supposed to trust this person, and that adult sucked on his penis. Think of the confusion that child experienced. Think of the pain when he realizes as he grows older that this is not normal, this was not okay. The anger that he experienced as he grew older and realized this man was never held accountable. When Eric was 5 years old, his kindergarten teacher reported his clothing was dirty, it was too small, his sneakers were separated from his soles, he never had a backpack. She couldn't reach his mother. When Eric was 6 years old, he slept on the floor in an apartment that stunk of urine. He stood on the street corner and asked passersby to give him money for food. When Eric was 7 years old, his mom gave guardianship to family friends, supposedly because she was ill, but really because she had to serve jail time. That family reported Eric would hit his own head and say, "I want this stuff to get out of my head." While he lived with this other family, Eric went to therapy for the first time. He forged a connection with his therapist. He had a safe space to express his anger and his confusion as his mom disappeared and reappeared over and over and over. He confided that her boyfriend was abusive and mean, and he was scared. He said he wanted to stay with his guardians where he felt safe. He told that therapist, "I wish I had a normal mom like you." And Eric made progress. His behavior improved until he got pulled back into his mother's orbit. As his mother's visitation increased, as she kept increasingly talking about taking him back, his behavior worsened. And when Eric was 9 years old, his mother regained custody. She took him for an intake at a mental health service office. And at the very first appointment, she had a seizure. Her eyes rolled back in her head. She passed out. When she woke up, she was incoherent. She couldn't stand. The therapist was understandably concerned that this was drug-related and called DCYF. And nothing happened. They investigated. They closed the case. But he didn't see that therapist for very long, just a few sessions. And he told the therapist his mother had warned him, "Don't say anything. She'll tell the state." When Eric was 10 years old, he told yet another therapist that his mom wanted to leave her abusive boyfriend. But he was worried about this because where will we live? That's not a concern a 10-year-old boy should have. Well, that same therapist wanted to engage in something called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy with Eric. She wanted to try to repair some of the damage that he'd already suffered. And she told his mom it was really important to bring him in regularly. She agreed. Eric had one session. One. When Eric was 11 years old, he and his mother were homeless again. His mother described him as continually filthy. His school described him as continually filthy and exhausted. Sean and Cassandra Sweeney arranged with his mom to take Eric for a few months while she went down to Florida to see family. But at the last moment, his mother reneged on the deal. She took Eric down to Florida with her. There was yet another DCYF investigation open at the time, but it closed as she moved to Florida. Down in Florida, Eric lived in an old, moldy camper next door to his aunt's. His mom and her boyfriend frequently disappeared for days at a time, using meth, crack, fentanyl. He never knew when she would come back. Each of these events, these vignettes in Eric's life, these are life-altering, brain-altering experiences. Eric was repeatedly neglected and abused by the adults in his life. This kind of persistent neglect and abuse changes how a child's brain develops. It does deep psychological damage. At every turn, Eric was failed by the adults who were supposed to protect him. Out of his mother's 7 children, he was the only one who stayed in her custody. the only one. Over and over again, concerned adults contacted New Hampshire DCYF. And over again, DCYF closed cases as unfounded and left Eric in his mother's care. In June of 2019, Eric was 12 years old, almost 13. He saw his older brother Sean and his wife Cassandra at a funeral. Eric walked around the funeral, underfed, dirty, greasy hair, wearing torn and outgrown clothes, asking any responsible adult he could find to take him in. Sean and Cassandra said yes. They were only 22 years old. Eric told us his happiest memory was going into his school principal's office, seeing Sean standing there and hearing him say, "You're coming home with me." Eric screamed so loudly the principal told him, "You're going to make me deaf." And when Sean and Cassandra took him in, they wanted to help him. They did everything they could. They took him to the doctor, they took him to the dentist, they contacted the area mental health agency. But as time went on, they began to fear that Eric was more than they could handle because he was deeply damaged. This 12-year-old boy was deeply impaired by attachment issues. He'd suffered a lifetime of neglect and a deep trauma history that had yet to be comprehensively treated. And he'd started that journey. He made a little dent in it back when he was 7 and 8, when he was with other guardians. He'd started to process feelings, learn how to express himself. But that was interrupted when his mom took him back. And she took him to therapists a few times, but nothing was ever consistent. The traumatic events continued to accumulate while he was in his mother's care, accelerating the damage to his developing brain. Sean and Cassandra were not sure if they could actually meet Eric's needs. And at times they told professionals, "This is too much, we can't keep him." They were particularly bothered by his habit of stealing food and keeping it in his room and lying about it. But they reconsidered. Sean didn't want his younger brother to feel abandoned yet again. They kept Eric because they wanted to help him. They wanted to do the right thing. They wanted to give him stability and love. But sometimes love is not enough. Eric did make progress again between 2019 and 2021. He had an excellent mental health worker named Lori from Lakes Region Behavioral Health. She visited twice a week and took Eric into the community. He often came into those sessions with Lori upset about punishment or complaining their expectations weren't fair. And she would talk him through it. She would guide him. She would say, "Was it really unfair? Are you maybe being a little bit of a jerk? Are you just used to not having any rules? Were they really being mean when they said, you have to empty the dishwasher right now? Or were they just exhausted because they had a baby and a toddler and 2 full-time jobs and they just wanted him to do his chores?" And Eric just did not know how to function in a normal household. But he really appreciated that Lori would tell him like it is. She'd also sometimes gently intervene to help Sean and Cassandra, suggesting more defined punishments, clearer expectations, because they were just trying to figure it out too. And they were only 10 years older than Eric. Over and over, when you read these records, you can see Eric process his feelings with Lori. She would ask him when he came in, started this session, "Where are you at on a scale of 1 to 10? And he'd give her a number. And then at the end of the session, he'd say, "Oh, I feel better now." And they'd give a different number that was lower in terms of how elevated he felt. He'd always say, "I feel better now that we talked about this." And Cassandra and Sean would tell Lori, "We're so happy that you're working with him. He's better when he talks to you." When she would go on vacation, they would say, "Oh, he was a mess while you were gone." Lori also got Eric involved in the Boys and Girls Club. He started feeling a sense of pride in himself, a sense that he belonged in a community, and that was very important to a child who had never stayed in one place long enough to form lasting connections. And then once again, his progress was interrupted. And this time it was not because of his mother, and it wasn't because of anyone wishing anything bad or trying to do anything hurtful. It was simply because Sean and Cassandra bought a house in Northfield in a different county, a different mental health catchment area. And they did this not because they were trying to harm Eric. No, they just wanted a better place for their sons to grow up. They wanted a house with a yard instead of an apartment. And it took them a long time to find the house. It's always difficult to find a house. But they finally found one that they loved, that they could afford. And Eric could tell how excited they were. And although he was worried about moving away from those supports, he said, yeah, let's do it. But unfortunately, that had the effect of once again short-circuiting Eric's progress. He lost that supportive relationship with Lori. He could no longer go to the Boys and Girls Club after school. In Eric, we have a brain severely compromised by trauma, and he was also in the midst of the storm of puberty. He had guardians who were straddling the line between parents and siblings. Both of them were working full-time, raising two very young children, no childcare, and they were simultaneously trying to meet Eric's needs, the needs of a deeply traumatized adolescent. And after the move, Eric fell into a depression. He had fits and starts of improvement. He was passing his classes in the fall of 2021, but then he got COVID in December. His grades dropped. Sean and Cassandra were upset. They grounded him indefinitely. And Lori wasn't there anymore to gently intervene or process with Eric to try to help him take some steps, get him back on track. He did have new counselors, but he just didn't connect with them in the same way. At this point, he'd had so many counselors over the years, so many different therapists. And the family settled into a standoff. Sean and Cassandra were angry with his behavior. They'd take privileges away. He would get angry. His immature brain would double down, say, why should I try? I'm gonna not try, as though that would somehow punish Sean and Cassandra instead of ultimately punishing himself. In March, Sean and Cassandra asked the family court to terminate the guardianship. And Sean wrote, I will not allow Eric to do something he cannot take back. Unfortunately, the court said no, and Eric stayed. The tension in the home and Eric's depression built until the June 2022 incident where he ran away and was subsequently hospitalized. Eric felt like he'd dug himself such a deep hole with Sean and Cassandra, he would never be able to climb out. He'd never be able to regain their trust. He wanted to start over. That's why he ran away originally. But really, that was not a realistic plan. He went to school the next morning. And when he came home from the hospital, things continued to deteriorate. He took Sean's power tools to build a fort. He left them out in the rain, ruining them. Eric made a crude weapon to imitate something he saw in The Walking Dead, and he left it outside, not thinking about the fact that his nephews could easily happen upon it. Sean and Cassandra were at their wits' end, understandably. They wanted Eric out of the house. Sean told police he was barely speaking to Eric. Eric did love his nephews, and he loved Sean and Cassandra. He was deeply grateful to them for taking him in. His time in the hospital helped him realize how lucky he was to be living there. He told his Riverbend worker that on August 27th, 2022, his 16th birthday. He told her how much he missed his nephews while in the hospital. That is Eric's history leading up to the day he shot Cassandra, Benjamin, and Mason. And what the state described to you was a premeditated murder, which is not what Eric pled guilty to. The state assumes that he brought that gun downstairs intending to shoot Cassandra, Benjamin, and Mason. They're discounting the possibility that he brought that gun downstairs with a different intention, like suicide. They're ignoring the possibility that something happened downstairs, perhaps someone saw the gun, and that Eric panicked. That version of events is also possible. We do not know what happened. Eric still cannot remember. We spent time explaining Eric's history because all of these facts are important to consider in the context of sentencing. Eric was 16 years old. When he came to live with Sean and Cassandra, he had spent 11 out of the past 13 years living in squalid, unsafe conditions. One of the things he often fought with Sean and Cassandra about was the fact that he would bring food to his room at night. And they said, we understand why you did that, why he does that. It's because he didn't have enough to eat with his mother. But what they didn't understand was that his brain was deeply damaged by all of those years of food insecurity. His brain was telling him each night that he had to have food with him. He had to have it as a matter of survival. Those years Eric spent with his mother damaged his brain and impaired his development. He couldn't just flip a switch to erase a lifetime of lived experience and just be a normal kid. In Miller v. Alabama, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that a sentencing court must take into account the fact that juvenile brains are not yet fully developed. Further, sentencing courts must consider a defendant's upbringing and weigh it more heavily than they would for an adult defendant. Miller was decided in 2012. Roper and Graham even earlier. Brain science has continued to advance since Miller. And now we'd wish to present testimony from Dr. Carrie Oyen regarding the effects of trauma on juvenile brain development.
Absolutely. Dr. Oyen, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. So, Doctor, I'm going to ask you to raise your right hand.
Okay.
Do you swear the testimony you're to give in this proceeding is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
If you would put your hand down and, again, state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
Absolutely. My name is Dr. Carrie Oyen, spelled K-A-R-I-O-Y-E-N.
Okay, thank you. Attorney Taggart-Hampton.
Thank you. Can you see me, Dr. Oyen? I think this is probably.
Not great, but I can move it. Yes.
It may be better if you kind of shift the podium a little bit. I just want to make sure that the state can also see, just so you're a little bit more at an angle, so that, I don't know if you're able to just tweak it a little bit. Attorney Hinckley, you're good with that? Yes. Okay, excellent.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Oyen. So I'm going to start by taking you through your CV a little bit. Can you tell us a bit about your educational background, Dr. Oyen?
Absolutely. So I received a psychology degree from Augustana University as my undergraduate degree. And then I went to the University of South Dakota, where I received my educational specialist degree in school psychology. At that point, then I practiced as a school psychologist in a local school district. I went back and got my PhD in school psychology from the University of South Dakota. I also have educational experiences in a postdoctoral fellowship at John Jay College. We were building pipelines of researchers in child maltreatment. And so it was a specialized postdoctoral fellowship experience where they were showing us different ways to conduct this kind of complicated research. I also had training in threat assessment, particularly the Dewey Cornell, what they call CSTAG. Historically, it was called the Virginia Student Threat Assessment Guidelines. And I am also a prepare trainer, so that means that I have been trained in school crisis prevention and response, and I also do that training for the state of South Dakota.
And where are you employed now?
I am a professor, an associate professor of school psychology at the University of South Dakota.
And what are your duties there?
So as a professor, there are three main components to our jobs. And so I do teaching and advising and mentoring. So in that space, it's considered teaching. I also conduct research, and they call that research and creative activities. And so I engage in peer-reviewed publications. I also have been engaged in writing book chapters and presenting at national conferences. And then the other part of my job, probably my favorite part of my job, is engaging in service. I do service to my university, my community, and the state and the nation.
And how long have you been at the University of South Dakota?
So I have been there for 8 years. Again, I want to highlight previously, I was a school psychologist at a local school district for 10 years. So I've been a school psychologist for 18 years.
And do you hold any licenses?
I do. So I am a licensed psychologist in the state of South Dakota, and that is through the South Dakota Board of Examiners of Psychologists. And that's really my one license.
And what about certifications?
So I hold 2 certifications. One of them is a South Dakota School Psychology certification. School psychologists are generally certified through South Dakota departments or through departments of education. And so I hold that certification through the South Dakota Department of Education. And I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist, and that is through the National Association of School Psychologists.
And do you have any publications in your field?
Yes, so if you look at, I have quite a list of publications, and I also have some publications that are in the process of peer review. Some of my most recent things, I think I will first just tell you a little bit about my research agenda, which is risk factors and protective factors and how they lead to student outcomes. I have 3 main components. One of them is child welfare. And so that means I partner with community partners to understand what that looks like, especially across the nation, what contexts we might see in child welfare. I also am heavily engaged in research about prevention programs and taking a look at the ways in which we can try to engage in prevention systems in school settings. And then I also take a look at child development, best practices in school settings, and then understanding the role of school psychology, knowing that school-based mental health providers are often one of the first lines of intervention. So we take a look at that and how that might impact student outcomes. Some of my publications, if you look at, you can look them up on Google Scholar, but some of the things that I do work on are things like advocacy. I've done work on prevention systems, things like chronic absenteeism. I'm particularly an expert in rural school psychology, so I do have things taking a look at teacher shortages. Right now I'm actually working on a peer-reviewed publication that's going through the process, taking a look at the unique aspects of rural school psychology. I also was integral in writing the standards for our national association. We had an update in 2020, and I sat on the writing team standards. I take a look at advocacy for school psychologists. In particular, we have a unique role in that we are both public employees as well as being advocates for children. I will say that this is also playing out right now across our nation about those that are talking about being advocates and public service employees. And then I also have critical elements of positive behavior support systems, and then also thinking about some of our practical journals and what does it mean to be an advocate. Related to this particular construct, there are kind of 3 things that I wanted to highlight. When we do national presentations at our National Association of School Psychologists, we go through a peer review process to get those pieces of research accepted into the conference. And so there are 2 particular things that are related to this. One of them is factors that lead to child maltreatment in rural settings. And the other one is called telescoping on flyover country, and really focusing on rural youth suicide, those risk factors and protective factors that lead to those outcomes. The other thing is a draft manuscript talking about rural child maltreatment. This was related to the grant funding that I received after our postdoctoral fellowship. It's talking about a review of risk and protective factors in a rural state.
Thank you very much. Your Honor, at this point, we're going to ask that the court certify Dr. Oyen as an expert in adolescent psychology.
Any objection? Okay. Dr. Oyen may give her opinions.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So Dr. Oyen, we hear a lot about adolescent brain development. What is unique about the adolescent brain as opposed to the adult brain?
What is really important for us to think about with adolescent decision making is that it's often quite misunderstood by lay people, by our society. I think that oftentimes, and research has supported this, that people attribute decisions in adolescence being associated with them not understanding the risk associated with a decision, or maybe not taking the time to consider the danger of a situation. In fact, when they have looked at this, they found that adolescents actually do consider, and sometimes they almost over consider, the risk that is associated with some of those decisions. However, there is something else at play. And so they do tend to make some different decisions, but it's not necessarily because they don't understand the risk associated with some of their decisions. What is really happening is that there are different parts of their brain that are being activated when they are approaching decisions. And what they call this is the social emotional system that's being activated. So it's not necessarily that they don't understand that there's risk associated with decisions. It's simply that, they're activating what we call the limbic system. It's your emotional brain. And oftentimes that emotional brain can be influenced by a lot of things. And in particular, the amygdala. The amygdala is really the size of an almond. And that amygdala we call it the fear center. And what's really fascinating about adolescents is that oftentimes they are guided in their decisions by that fear center. And it's also not the best decision maker for us. Again, it tends to be that we're mostly guided then by some of our emotions, concerns about how we're going to be judged by other people. And that tends to be how decisions are approached by the adolescents. There are kind of three main hypotheses about what's going on. One of them is the dopamine receptor remodeling theory. This is, simply put, this is an idea that dopamine tends to dip when you are approaching adolescence. How I like to describe dopamine is that it's that thing that you have inside of you that if you were to go to a casino, for example, and you hit the jackpot on the casino on one of the machines, and that feeling that you get, that reward center feeling, that's dopamine. And the theory is that there is less dopamine, and there's a dip when it comes to your adolescent time. And all of us in our adolescent period are trying to get more dopamine. And how do we generally tend to get that in our adolescent time? We tend to get that from our peers, from that approval from peers, and we'll do lots of things to try to feel better. The second theory is called buffer incapacity theory. This idea is truly that not only is it more challenging for you to, you have this dip in dopamine, buffer incapacity basically says that I need more hits, so if I were to compare it to the casino, it would be that I have to pull that trigger a lot more on the casino machines to try to get that feeling of dopamine. And so what does that mean? That means I need even more peer approval. I need even more access to those kinds of reward center, the reward seeking things before I would be able to feel the same kinds of things that I was feeling earlier in my life. And then the third thing, which is a really interesting area, I will tell you, it's becoming something that's really important to me as an expert in this area, is talking about hormones and the impact of hormones on the brain. There's some interesting things about the differences between men and women, in particular looking at testosterone, the impact of testosterone on decision making. There's also some really emerging cool research coming out about ADHD and taking a look at when are the most susceptible times for you to be dysregulated and engaged in poorer executive functioning. They're actually finding it to be in your adolescent times. And then, unfortunately, this is my own age, but it's perimenopause times. And so we just know that there's some things going on with hormones. They're a little bit more challenging to measure. I do want you to know that because in peer-reviewed literature, we tend to measure hormones by the use of maybe a hair follicle or a blood test. And those things are just looking at hormones when it comes to point in time. And that doesn't necessarily take a look at long-term impact of hormones.
And
The other thing, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so, we've spoken about the adolescent range. What age range are we talking about there?
Yeah, great question. I think historically, and if you would have asked me this in 2007, I would have told you approximately ages 12 to 18. Because of the things that we're learning and because this is a topic that's really relevant in this day and age, they've really expanded the age to be 12 to 19. And in fact, for some courts and in some cases, they're actually saying 10 to 24. And that's particularly because there's a whole emerging base of literature that talks about emerging adults. And, nothing magical happens when you turn 18. And so we know that in brain science that your prefrontal cortex in particular is still in development. And it's not fully developed until, some people like to fight about this, but it's generally agreed upon that it's either age 27 all the way to age 30. And so we know that prefrontal cortex is still in development, and that's why they're really expanding the age ranges of what it means to be an adolescent.
You spoke a little bit earlier about the difference in sort of decision making between adolescents and adults. So can you explain that difference a little bit more?
Again, when we think about how we approach decision making, typically decision making in your adolescence is heavily influenced by that developing brain. And again, particularly that reward center, that's thinking more about that thing called dopamine. Also about your amygdala. Remember, that's our fear center. So if you think about that, we have kind of two vulnerabilities there. And again, we are heavily influenced by our amygdala, which is that fear center. And again, that gives us that emotional and, needing reward kind of context, especially in group settings or even in a setting, I do want to talk about this a little bit, where there might not necessarily be a peer present or another person, but what it is that I have that fear of judgment. Right now I actually am living with adolescents, and I think about this all the time because I live it. And what I see a lot of is that even if I'm not in the actual presence of a peer, I'm oftentimes feeling like I am under the microscope. It's almost like you have a video camera on yourself in that age. And that is helping to govern your decisions because it feels like I'm being judged by other people constantly. And I want to make sure that I'm doing things that will keep me kind of in good graces.
So when you say peers, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so typically when we say peers, when they do the studies, I do want to be very clear, oftentimes the studies regarding adolescent decision making have to do with driving. They are fascinating, and they are to do with, either being by yourself in a car and the kind of risky decisions that you tend to be making. It does turn out that when adolescents are in a car by themselves, without peers present, without any even thinking peers are present, they tend to drive and make the same kinds of decisions as their adult counterparts. They also do these kinds of pieces of research with even things like computer modulated kinds of events, like blowing up a balloon on a computer and trying to stop it right before it pops, those kinds of things. And what they have found with adolescents is that once you have a peer in the car with you, for example, you do tend to make riskier decisions. The other thing that's so fascinating about adolescent decision making is that even if they take the peer out, it tends to be that you're still making poorer decisions, just even if you think that the peer is in the car with you. And why does that matter for all of these things, and who is the peer? I think that initially we thought it was your same-aged peers, but over time it's come to be anybody that is judging me or anybody that I'm interpreting as judging me. And I think that that's really important, especially in the context of courts, because sometimes we can say, well, but they're in the room by themselves, or I'll have a teacher say to me, but they're in the room by themselves while I'm trying to get them to do their math assignment. And it's like they might be by themselves, but they are still quite concerned about the judgment that I might experience from those that are like me.
So switching gears a little bit, what does the research tell us about an adolescent's understanding of future consequences?
Oh, that's such a great question. When it comes to adolescent decision making and navigating consequences, there is this concept called future discounting. And oftentimes, when we look at adolescents' brains, we find that they are in the here and now, meaning that I don't think about the future. I tend to discount the future, or I might even discount what would happen if I engage in some sort of risky behavior, like, oh, that's not going to happen to me. Oftentimes, it is more acting on impulse, misreading social cues, and kind of engaging in more dangerous behavior. I might I might act before I think about it. I might struggle to understand the consequences of actions, and might struggle to kind of make those connections, especially in that adolescent time. That's why, on the reverse side of negative consequence, this is also why this is the time of growth and development. You're kind of thinking about all these things at the same time. Unfortunately, it does lead to what we call future discounting, meaning that I'm not likely to think about the consequences of my actions.
And then sort of finally on that topic, what does the research tell us about this adolescent brain development and the connection to working memory?
Oh, that's a great question too. I think that in particular, working memory is a really interesting construct. It's our ability to take in information, think about it, and work with it, and then kind of share something else out. And when it comes to working memory, one of the key regions of your brain that is activated is something that we call the prefrontal cortex, and we've been talking a little bit about this, right? The prefrontal cortex is your ability to think about things from start to finish. It's your ability to organize. It's really kind of the governor in a lot of ways for you to be able to kind of navigate this world, especially decision making. And what's so important for us to know about adolescence is that is still in development. So what does that mean? Well, because we're still doing a lot of that reorganization and having those patterns develop in our brain, it can show that over time through your adolescence, you're actually creating more what we call superhighways. And so what you're doing is you're actually then be able to make decisions better. That's why people about how they make decisions when they're 15 as opposed to somebody when they are 30. You can see that they're actually influenced by a lot of different things. I'm in my 40s and I'm far less influenced by my peers or by other people when I make decisions. I think about my past experiences. I activate, my prefrontal cortex that allows me to think about things from start to finish, and then I'm better able to make decisions. And so what does working memory have to do with this? When you have less developed prefrontal cortex, your working memory suffers.
So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about trauma with you. Can you talk about what ACEs are?
ACEs was a pretty fundamental study that happened, and what they determined is that there were these adverse childhood experiences that were key areas of abuse, neglect, household challenges that were linked to poor health and well-being outcomes for later on.
And can you take us through sort of the list of ACEs?
And there are readily accepted checklists out there, but what do they generally include? They include abuse, so physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect, physical neglect or emotional neglect, and then household challenges, things like mental illness, intimate partner violence, parental separation or divorce, incarceration, substance misuse, or dependence.
Are there particular ACEs that have a greater impact on an adolescent than others?
So I think it is really important for us to remember that it can be fairly common for someone to have one or even two ACEs. Over 39% of youth have one ACE. It does go down, about cuts in half. About 17% have experienced 2 or more ACEs. It is really important to note, though, that only 0.01% of people have a reported ACEs score of greater than 8. It is also important to think about the who. So women tend to be most impacted by sexual abuse, and men tend to be most impacted by parental depression, parental anxiety, parental alcohol and drug use, and what we call economic adversity. So that would be things like stability of housing, those kinds of things. Again, it does matter the different types of ACEs that children experience. So again, if you are a female and experience sexual abuse, it tends to have poor outcomes. And the ones that I listed for males, parental depression, parental anxiety, parental alcohol and drug use, and economic adversity tend to have larger impacts on juvenile youths.
What would the significance of a person having all 10 ACEs be?
First of all, it's extremely rare to have all 10 ACEs. Because it is extremely rare, there aren't a significant amount of peer-reviewed literature on them. You know, some of the things that I've seen in our peer review base talk about, the rarity of it. I already said that, if you had 8 or more, the likelihood of it happening is 0.01%. And so because of that repeated trauma, it can cause that instability in regulation, hyperarousal, kind of those impulsive defenses to what we call neutral events. The biggest thing I would say to you is that it is pretty significant for a person to experience all those things and not have an impact on things like how they're perceiving threats or how they're perceiving the world around them. For a child to have all of these things happen to them, the world doesn't feel like a very safe place for them. And it can be challenging to navigate that space because the people, especially the adults that are supposed to care for you, have not.
Doctor, hold on 1 second. 1 second. Rachel, are we recording?
Oh, yeah, the light went off.
I just want to make sure that we're getting a record of what we're talking about, and I did not notice the clock stopped functioning.
Oh, no. Okay.
No, just hold on 1 second. I just want to make sure. I think we got a record of this. I just want to confirm that that's the case.